Mencius Moldbug is a neo-reactionary blogger. I've seen his name brought up frequently in YouTube videos recently. Although I've known about him for a while due to the Distributus channel, only recently have I read anything that he's written. Now that I've read one of his books, A Gentle Introduction in the Unqualified Reservations, I thought I would give you my thoughts. Having read his book, I disagree with Moldbug on many things. He's a reactionary, I'm a conservative. He wants to end democracy in the United States. I'd like to try and salvage it. With that being said, I believe I can take some of Mencius Moldbug's ideas and use them to create a brand new theory of conservative politics. I'm going to attempt to do this by fusing Moldbug's philosophy with that of Leo Strauss and Patrick Deneen. Moldbug's analysis starts with the separation of church and state. To have a functional democracy, church had to be separated from the government. Otherwise, there would be an issue of legitimacy. Let me give you an example. Suppose a high-ranking church official comes out and indicates that church doctrine indicates that no-fault divorce is unacceptable and morally wrong. If the voters then went ahead and legalized no-fault divorce, it would create a political crisis. In order to separate church from state, you have to know what a church is. What is a religion? Is it a belief in something supernatural? Well, Buddhism doesn't believe in anything supernatural. Does that mean it's not a religion? Religions are things that tell people what they ought to do. They're inherently pre- and proscriptive. By separating the church from state, the United States removed the ability of the government to control what people believe is right or wrong. For most of our country's history, this wasn't a problem. People's churches told them what they ought and ought not to do. Since Protestants and Catholics agreed on most issues of morality, a moral consensus still existed. This allowed our democracy to function properly. When people stopped going to church starting in the 1960s, it created a massive power vacuum. That vacuum was filled by what Moldbug describes as the Cathedral. The Cathedral is America's secret state church. Now, every political faction has its boogeyman. For Trump supporters, it's the globalists. For the left, it's the neoliberals. I myself have often called out the neoliberals on this channel. To the alt-right, well, we know who their boogeyman is. What I fail to appreciate until reading Moldbug is that the Cathedral is not the same thing as the neoliberals. It's an entirely different monster. Number 1, the neoliberals. The neoliberals represent a uniparty that has controlled the US government for decades. Neoliberals support globalism, libertarian economic policy, and identity politics. Donald Trump is the first to successfully challenge the neoliberals. That being said, Trump himself is a sort of odd duck neoliberal. Trump, for example, supports globalism, but in a form that prioritizes fairness to America. Trump also supports his own unique form of identity politics. Trump's version of identity politics allows him to be politically incorrect and defend the continued existence of things like Confederate statues. At the same time, Trump is very eager to talk about how much he's lowered the black unemployment rate. Examples of neoliberals would include politicians like George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Mitt Romney. On YouTube, I believe Destiny is the most neoliberal YouTuber. Number 2, the Cathedral. The Cathedral is what filled the vacuum when people stopped going to church. It consists of universities, the mainstream media, and the courts. The Cathedral views its ideas as being based solely in science, legal precedent, and rationalism. Its morality takes the form of a dystopian form of Puritanism. This isn't all that surprising given that the Ivy League universities are located in the Northeast. This is the same location the Puritans settled in America. Moldbug demonstrates the immorality of the Cathedral by explaining the Cathedral's position on global warming. While warming temperatures is an undisputed fact, the Cathedral cannot prove what effects it will have on Earth's atmosphere because of problems with the predictive validity of science. I talked about these same problems using science as a political tool in another video I did. Realizing that its scientific case is flawed, the Cathedral moralizes the issue. It declares a consensus of scientists are concerned about global warming, and it tries to shame people into caring about it. You don't support a Green New Deal? You're an irrational science denier. The moral prescriptions that come out of the Cathedral are that you should trust and obey their scientists and experts. If you don't, well, then it's witch burning time. Putting aside all of the supernatural stuff in the Bible, answer me the following question. In terms of just morality, are you more likely to find moral truth reading the Bible or listening to the media and university? Exactly. Regardless of how much faith you have, it's unquestionable that the Bible is a legitimate source of moral wisdom. On the other hand, the morality that emerges from the Cathedral is a dangerous form of pseudo-morality. As a matter of politics, the Cathedral agrees with the Neoliberals on globalism and identity politics. On economic policy, though, it consists of many dissenters who are socialist and communist. Now, Moldbug describes himself as the anti-Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is a radical left-wing professor who argues that a cabal of corporations use the media and think tanks to manufacture consent. They do this in order to gain social control over people. Moldbug says that actually the complete opposite is in fact true. Academics like Chomsky use the institutions of the Cathedral to dominate over corporations. They do this in order to manufacture consent and gain social control over the corporations and then ultimately individual people. Why does Google display this message? How does it help them? The product that Google sells is that it has an objective search engine that will deliver you the best results. Putting a message like this on the main Google site undermines their product by revealing that they are not in fact neutral, but biased and racist. They nonetheless do this not in their own interest, but because they fear people like Chomsky. So what are the implications of this? Well, now it's time to shift to Patrick Deneen. America is constantly becoming more and more liberalized by two separate currents. The neoliberals controlling Congress and the presidency push for libertarian economic policies. Smaller government, less regulation, more free trade and globalism. Meanwhile, the Cathedral pushes for progressivism. When it comes to economic progressivism, the Cathedral clashes with the neoliberals and only rarely makes progress. However, when it comes to the social justice issues, it wins 100% of the time. Meanwhile, the conservatives always lose. Many conservatives were shocked earlier this week when the conservative Supreme Court found that the Constitution protects the rights of transgendered people. This is, of course, despite the fact that the word gender does not exist in the US Constitution. This is yet another chapter in the mythology of transgender rights. Our society is rigged so that conservatives always lose. Patrick Deneen takes it for granted that conservatives will always lose in a liberal state. On the contrary, Moldbug is actually able to posit an explanation as to exactly why it is that conservatives always lose. Progressives have the goal of progress. The more progress, the better. The progressives can never be satiated because there is always more that can be done to help the poor, help the blacks, or help the gays. Meanwhile, the goal of conservatives is poorly defined. Are we trying to preserve the status quo or go back to some earlier period of time? Answering this question is always going to divide the conservative movement. To the extent that it's the latter, conservatives also have to deal with all of the baggage of rolling back so-called progress. Now here's where Moldbug completely blew my mind. How do conservatives adapt to this problem? According to Moldbug, they state their cause as vaguely as possible in order to attract the largest number of followers. This explains everything about YouTube politics. It explains why Sargon of Akkad portrays himself as a centrist liberal. It's why Tim Pool identifies himself as a liberal, even though his audience is certainly entirely made up of conservatives. It's why the more popular right-wing channels don't interact with the more conservative, smaller YouTube channels. It's also why BreadTube is a coherent block, but conservatives are divided from each other. One way for conservatives to avoid this problem would be to commit to renewing the classical Western moral tradition. This would allow them to combat the moral influence of the Cathedral. That way we could all have a uniform goal. However, Moldbug has an even better idea for a conservative takeover. According to Moldbug, progressivism is a self-contradiction. Leo Strauss's second-wave progressives don't actually fix any of the problems inherent in first-wave liberalism. Instead, they cause liberalism to decay. Leftism is therefore nothing but decay being disguised as progress. The only reason the United States still functions as a country is due to all of the conservatives holding the line and preventing the decay. So how can we take down the Cathedral? Well, we should start by looking for a historical precedent. The closest thing that we can find is the Protestant Reformation. During the Reformation, Protestants successfully challenged the moral authority of the Catholic Church. If the center of power of the Cathedral is the university, to achieve a reformation, we need to form a conservative antiversity. This is just like how the Protestants formed their own church. We then need to make our antiversity into a viable alternative to the modern university. By doing this, we can turn the disadvantage of the conservatives into an advantage. At the same time, we can also turn the advantage of the progressives into a disadvantage. Remember, the problem with conservatism is that it lacks a coherent goal. This means that if we form a conservative antiversity, we are well positioned to be neutral and objective. Progressives, on the other hand, have an agenda, the pursuit of progress, which means their credibility is already compromised. Because Moldbug believes progressivism is decay, he suggests that conservatives abandon politics altogether and focus on creating this antiversity. This would empower the socialists in the Cathedral to go to war with the neoliberals running the government. If the Cathedral starts feuding with the neoliberals, it will lose credibility and suffer from the political decay caused by the progressives. Meanwhile, the conservatives can try and court our country's institutions, the military, the police, businesses, government agencies, that they ought to listen to our more politically neutral antiversity rather than the biased and politically compromised Cathedral. Once our antiversity has displaced the university, we simply steal their grift. We slowly but surely move the country further and further to the right. Now, Moldbug wants to use this ultimately as a basis for a coup to replace our democratic government with some sort of weird corporate monarchy. I don't agree with that. I don't want some weird Moldbugian monarchy. The problem with the Cathedral is its pseudo-morality. It tells people that they need to listen to our experts and scientists. We don't want to create a right-wing version of this. Instead, the goal should be a renewal of classic Western morality, like what Leo Strauss calls for. A new moral consensus based on our classical Western tradition. The goal should be a new American democracy without the separation of church and state. By that, I don't mean a theocracy. We shouldn't take one of the pre-existing religions and turn it into an official state religion. Instead, we should have a constitution that formally encodes our virtues. That way we can have a shared moral consensus that will allow our democracy to function correctly. Now that is how you would truly make America great again. Now this was supposed to be the end of the video. This video was supposed to come out yesterday. Yesterday's audio recording, however, is mysteriously missing. So without the audio, I could not finish the video, and I had to re-record the audio today. In light of that, I thought I'd throw in some bonus Moldbug content for those that made it this far. So let's talk about Moldbug's view on race. On the one hand, he seems to give an analysis very similar to my own, but at the same time he hints that his actual position is a lot more black-pilled. Number 1. Mencius Moldbug says that the Civil Rights Act made black people into aristocrats. This makes it socially dangerous for non-blacks to interact with them. Only bad things can happen when a pleb pisses off an aristocrat. This explains why the police have featured prominently in all this recent drama regarding black people. Number 2. Moldbug says that if a black person from 1960 traveled to contemporary times in a time machine, then they would probably assume that the KKK had taken over the United States. This is due to how dysfunctional black people have come over the last 60 years. They used to get married and have families and work regular jobs, but that doesn't happen anymore. Number 3. In light of this, Moldbug advocates for repealing the Civil Rights Act. It's not been good for blacks. It's not been good for whites. The only good thing it did was end segregation in the South, but that's over and done with, so we don't need it anymore. Number 4. His views are basically verbatim what I said in this video. I said the Civil Rights Act transferred social power to blacks and that it made them feel entitled. That entitlement broke the black family and caused social decay. Remember Moldbug's theory that leftism is in fact decay. Now, these are all the positive things that I have to say about Moldbug on race. Now I'm going to get a little bit more critical. Moldbug's Wikipedia page has a section about Moldbug's view on race, which emphasizes IQ differences. Now, in the book that I read, Moldbug does not discuss race and IQ. Now, I haven't read any of Moldbug's other writings. However, based on what I have read, I do have reason to believe both of the following. Number 1. The Wikipedia page on Moldbug is a thinly veiled attempt at character assassination. Number 2. Moldbug is not being completely honest about his views on race, at least not in the book I read. Let's start with Wikipedia. The last line on the view of race does contain quotations from the book I read. Wikipedia states, in 2009, he wrote that since U.S. civil rights programs were applied to populations with recent hunter-gatherer ancestry and no great reputation for sturdy moral fiber, the result was absolute human garbage. My first observation is that Wikipedia is just straight up lying to you. Moldbug said making black people into aristocrats resulted in absolute human garbage. The second quote is falsely being associated with the first quote. That being said, that first quote is a real Moldbug quote and one that I find to be pretty objectionable. Prior to making this quote, Moldbug clarifies it is directed at non-Asian minorities. In America, that pretty much means it's directed at blacks and Hispanic. He then refers to these people as recent hunter-gatherers. This is bullshit. For one. Most Hispanics in the US are from Mexico and Central America. Their racial heritage is a mix of European and Native American. To the extent that they are Native American, they are largely descendants of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were an agricultural society ruled by a wealthy emperor. They were not hunter-gatherers. Or two. Black slaves that were brought to America from West Africa also came from agricultural kingdoms. The Black Bantu people conquered and replaced the population of Africa after domesticating tropical crops like bananas and sorghum. These blacks also lived in agricultural societies ruled by wealthy kings or princes. Moldbug then indicates that these people have no great reputation for sturdy moral fiber. For blacks in contemporary society, I guess I agree with the usual caveat of not all blacks. For Hispanics, I don't really associate them with immorality or sturdy morality. So I guess technically Moldbug is correct, but why is he even making this point? How does this help his argument? Anyways, that being said, Moldbug is a smart guy who knows a lot about history. Like I said, I have my disagreements with him. He has some rather strange beliefs, as I do myself. Overall, though, I think he has some pretty useful ideas that make a contribution to right-wing thinking. Anyways, that's it for the bonus content. Thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed the video, please support small YouTube channels like mine by subscribing. Thank you.